Okay, well, hopefully you're in your Bibles in Judges chapter 18, and really this is a continuation of last week's message in Judges 17. And if you remember, in Judges 17, we met a gentleman by the name of Micah who stole a bunch of silver, a bunch of money from his mother, and then when she cursed him or threatened to curse him, he returned it, and she rewarded him by using a portion of that silver to create an idol that Micah went on to worship, along with making an ephod for himself, which is a priestly garment, as well as making other household gods to worship, as well as hiring a Levite to be an official priest in his home. He started a cult. He just started his own little religion in his home just like that. And this was occurring in the days of the judges. This is that time when everyone was doing right in their own eyes, and it's meant to be a little microcosm of the attitudes that were in people's hearts that caused the Lord to bring judgment against them during the time of Judges. And so whether it was the Philistines or the Midianites, they would come against the Israelites because of this kind of behavior. So this is filling in the gaps of, well, what was everybody doing? Well, they're going around, they're making their own religions in their home, even though they're supposed to be worshiping God and God alone. Now, to multiply that, today we're going to see that from Micah's idolatry, we also get the idolatry of an entire tribe, the tribe of Dan. And so we begin in the first words, or the opening verses of Judges chapter 18, like this. In those days, there was no king in Israel, just like we saw in Judges 17:6. And in those days, the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, "Go and explore the land." And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. When they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. And they turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" And he said to them, "This is how Micah dealt with me. He's hired me, and I've become his priest." And they said to him, "Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of Yahweh." This story in Judges 18 tells us about the tribe of Dan and how they ended up outside of their inheritance and fell into idolatry. There's an expression that you see later on in the Old Testament from Dan to Beersheba, and it's meant to talk about from the northernmost parts of Israel to the southernmost. So it's just an expression from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan was this northernmost city. But if you know the tribe of Dan and their story, their inheritance is in the middle of the promised land. So part of the reason for this is to explain how they ended up so far north with this city called Dan. Now, again, who is the tribe of Dan? It's kind of ironic. The word Dan in Hebrew means judge. Although the word for judge in the book of Judges is shofet, for the noun, so a judge, shofet, and shafat, shafat for the verb. So it's a different word. It's like a synonym for judge. So Dan means judge. Daniel, the name Daniel, means God is my judge or God judges, just for reference. El means God. So Daniel means God is my judge. Dan is another word for judge. It's kind of an irony because this is the book of Judges, but we're going to see that the tribe of Dan has the least judgment out of any group that we've seen so far, any tribe. Now, where did they get their name from? Well, it comes from the name of the founder, or not the founder, the son of Jacob, Dan. Remember, Jacob had 12 sons, for which all the tribes of Israel are named. And in Genesis 30, you don't have to turn there, we start getting into Jacob's sons. Now, you have to understand, this was a whole big mess. Remember, Jacob had 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, right? He got Leah first, but didn't love her, and he worked like 7 years or more than that to finally get the real wife he wanted, Rachel. So there's animosity between these 2 women, these 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. And they weaponized their children. It's like, well, I'm obviously the favored one if I have more kids. So they started fighting using their kids. Now, it's kind of absurd to us, but you have to think in a culture where they highly valued children, where children were seen as a blessing and evidence of your power and your prosperity. They had this mentality. Now, Rachel was jealous that Leah's having babies, and she demands that Jacob conceive a child with her maidservant, Bilhah. So actually, Dan is a child not of Rachel or Leah, but of a maidservant of Rachel, Bilhah. And his name is Dan because she said, finally, God has given me justice. Now, whether that is legitimately what happened, that God is seeing the plight of Rachel and blessing a child conceived not in the marriage, I think it's a misplaced kind of statement. That's from her perspective, finally, God's bringing me justice. It's kind of an irony because if you read that whole chapter, it's all kinds of mess up. They're fighting by having kids. And then when Leah can't have any kids, Leah says, Jacob, you have a kid with my maidservant. And then later on, they're having a fight, and they basically make a deal, Rachel and Leah. Well, if you give up this, then you can sleep with Jacob and have a kid with him. It's crazy. It's all messed up. And of course, that's how you get these 12 tribes. They are not some noble clan. When we talked this morning about the kingdom of Israel, understand that those 12 sons that make up the 12 tribes of Israel, these are not like people born from the highest courts and honors. These are people that are born from concubines and servants, from very petty women fighting. Now, in Genesis 49, there's blessings being given out to these 12 sons. They're in Egypt, and Jacob is giving a blessing to his children. They're going to be the chosen people, right? They're going to make a nation, and he gives a blessing. Here's Dan's blessing. You tell me how this strikes you in Genesis 49. You can turn there if you want, but you tell me how this strikes you. Genesis 49, 16 through 18. So all the children are getting blessed. He's putting his hand on them. Jacob's putting his hand on them. He says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Yahweh. So that's kind of an inauspicious blessing, right? You're going to judge the people. How are you going to be a judge amongst your people? Well, you're basically going to bother them a lot. You're going to mess them up. You're going to cause them to stumble and fall like a snake that's snapping at the heels of a horse that bucks its rider off. Like, is that good? Is that bad? What does that mean? And then it's like, I'm going to need salvation, God, because of Dan. It's a funny kind of statement, but as you'll see, Dan ends up being exactly that, and they even, possibly even, are kind of stricken from the record. So we'll get into that in just a second. Now, Judges 18, going back to there, it says that they're looking for a place because they had no inheritance in the land. If you remember back in Joshua, when they come in to conquer the land, the 12 tribes come in, and there's allotments made. So they kind of cast lots, who gets what portion of the promised land. Now, everybody got a piece except for the Levites. And Levites had 48 cities that they were to dwell in, but they're to serve God. They had no inheritance. Their inheritance was serving the Lord. So, but everyone else did get a plot of land, including Dan. I meant to put a different map on your handout, or another map, but you can probably in the back of your Bible. It'll have a map, and Dan's portion was on the coast, sort of in the middle. It's a little bit north and west of Jerusalem, and it's right next to the Ephraimites, right next to Judah, right next to Philistia, and it was a decent plot of land. It had a coastal access, so you could fish and put ships out to the sea. There was a little bit of a valley. And so they did have an inheritance. It's not that they didn't have an inheritance, but what happens in Joshua 19:47 is that they failed to conquer it. This land was given to the Israelites, but they had to do something for it. They had to exercise faith. And if they exercised faith, they were going to come up against these pagan nations who are more numerous, more powerful than them, and they would defeat them. But what's implied that Dan did not push out the pagan nations that were there in their little inheritance, it reflected the fact that they had no faith. Now, this is not universally applicable. It's not like you can get that promotion if you have enough faith, or you can get an A on that test if you have enough faith. No, this is a specific promise that was given to Israel when they came into the land. If you would just believe me, I will win your battles for you. Well, they didn't believe God, and so Joshua 19:47 says they did not conquer the land because of their lack of faith. Not only that, the beginning of Judges, you probably don't remember, I didn't remember, in Judges 1:34 and 35, the Amorites, big bullies, they bullied them into the hills of Ephraim, which is their another brother tribe. So they're getting pushed into the land of another tribe, into their inheritance, into those hills, and you can kind of see that on the map on the back of your handout. We also know that the Philistines, who were just south of them, were a problem for Dan because Samson, who famously fought Philistines, Samson was from the tribe of Dan himself. And it's perhaps the case that some of his compromising attitude, remember him, is the cultural heritage of living amongst the tribe that never fully committed to the Lord. So, while they technically did have an inheritance, they never really claimed it, and they could not claim it because of their faithlessness. And rather, and the two towns that are mentioned here, Zorah and Eshtaol, that's technically towns in their allotment, but they're being pushed out of it. And it's because of their own faithlessness. And rather than exercise the faith in God so that they can remove the inhabitants, the pagan inhabitants of the land, they instead chose to, we'll just find another place. It's sin. What they're about to do next, almost everything they do is going to be sinful in the eyes of God. Now, will God use it? Yes. But almost everything they do is going to be sinful here. So their whole scouting mission, it shouldn't be happening. They should have been investing in repentance, not in scouts. So they send 5 scouts out, and they happen upon the house of our friend Micah, who we met last week, who has just started his own cult in his home, even though he was supposed to be a worshiper of Yahweh. They recognized the voice of the Levite priest. Might have been a dialectical thing, might have been that they knew the guy. But here's again a Levite priest. Their job, their set-aside job, is to worship and serve the Lord. They don't even have an inheritance or allotment so that they could say, I'd much rather, plow my fields. You don't have fields, Levites. You have these cities that you live in to minister to the people of Israel, your brothers, and to minister to the Lord. That's your job. But here he is in the house of an individual man who has broken the first 3 commandments by worshiping other gods, making a graven image, and taking the Lord's name in vain by attributing the things he's doing to God. And here he is helping Micah worship false gods and idols. It's pathetic. It tells you the state of the heart of the people, that they did right in their own eyes, that there was no king to enforce. You can't do that. You can't just worship other gods. You can't just start a cult in your home. Now, these 5 scouts don't seem to be bothered at all by the Levite story. If they were righteous men, if these men of Dan were righteous men, they would have rebuked the Levite for being a priest for hire. God doesn't hire or employ priests. He doesn't put out a job listing on LinkedIn or Indeed or something. He called the Levites by virtue of them being from the tribe of Levi. And they served out of both a sense of duty, but also privilege. God doesn't hire servants. He's not hiring you to serve him, right? You're not hired to do this. I'm not hired to serve the Lord. People are gracious to give to this ministry and support me, but none of us who are called Christians or citizens of the kingdom are there because you're a contractor. God doesn't contract people. He doesn't hire priests. And so it is especially bad that this Levite is a priest for hire. And it should have been insulting to the tribe of Dan. They are, after all, the ones to judge. But we know the Danites aren't righteous men. The mission they're on is because of their dissatisfaction and disability to stay in their house or in their inheritance, and ultimately their disbelief in the true God of Israel. That is why they are going to ask this false priest, hey, could you ask God for us a question like whether what we're doing is okay or not? And the priest gives a blessing on them, but really when you look at it, he doesn't really say anything at all. I think this is genius in a way, in that kind of very subversive, twisted kind of evil genius. Because he says, go in peace. That's a very generic kind of statement, like shalom, right? That's just a generic kind of statement. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. You would say that to anybody, go in peace when they're leaving your house. You say, go in peace. And he says, the journey on which you go is under the eye of Yahweh. And that phrase, under the eye of Yahweh, think about this. Is that really a blessing? Technically, everything is under the eye of Yahweh, isn't it? Look at Proverbs 5:21. You don't have to turn there, but it's almost the exact same wording. But this proverb says, for a man's ways are before the eyes of Yahweh, and he ponders all his paths. It's just the generic idea that everything we do is something that the Lord sees and scrutinizes, right? So was this pseudo-priest just being clever, letting the Danites interpret his blessing however they wanted, knowing that they're going to interpret it favorably? Was he hedging his bets a little bit? So just in case God called him into account, right? Like, how dare you speak a blessing on them? He could say, well, technically, God, I didn't say anything wrong, did I? Are not their ways before your eyes? It's a funny kind of negotiation. I think of that because it's familiar territory. I mean, how many of you have not tried, if you've been a believer very long, tried to outsmart or outwit or make a deal with God, right? As if he doesn't know your heart and intention. Like the silly thing I would do when I was a kid is, you're shooting hoops, and it's like, oh, God, if I make this, I'm going to be a millionaire, right? You do something silly like that. And it's very silly and obvious. But there are serious moments when you're sitting there, and God, if you take away this cancer, I will serve you forever and ever, right? Or if you let my kid get into this school, I'll donate to this charity. And you think you can outsmart or outwit God. That you can hide something from him, like hide a motive from him. What he's doing here, whether he's trying to hedge his bet, whether he's being clever, whether he thinks he's actually giving a blessing to them, it's all a trick. It's all a scam that's banking on exactly the opposite. The only way this works is if you think God cannot see my motive, that God cannot know what I'm trying to pull. I'm trying to pull a sneaky on him. Look at Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12 through 13. Very similar verbiage, actually. In Hebrews 4, 12 and 13 says, for the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him whom he must give account. So here the writer of Hebrews is saying the word of God has this power to strike you, to make you question your own thoughts, your motives, your intentions. It can discern that because God can discern that. And if you're if you're blessed, you will see your own duplicity. You will see your own motives and intentions, that they're not right. And you will see yourself as God sees yourself, before whom nothing is hidden. We are naked and exposed. So, ironically, this priest invoking this idea that everything is under the eye of Yahweh as a blessing, it is a blessing in a way. It is a blessing because if all our ways under God's eyes, the application is that we can't get away with anything. That could be one. And that's a terrifying thought, that you can't get away with anything. But it's not just a terrifying thought. It's a comforting one. Because if God really does see and know everything about us, even the things that are very deep down, hidden from everyone else, no one else knows it, the fact that he could see that and still sent Jesus, and Jesus still willingly died for my sins, well then, what do I have to be afraid or ashamed or embarrassed by? He saw it already. When he died on the cross, he saw every single thing I ever did and will do, and he still said, no, of course I will die for his sins. And that means I can come to him anytime, unashamed, ask forgiveness, ask for help, whatever it is. Yes, it's terrifying to think God sees and knows everything, but it makes then the cross all the more special because he was eyes wide open. You get married, and you really don't know who you're marrying, in a way, because you just don't know it. You don't really know anybody. You barely know yourself. You get married, and you're hoping that this person, loves the Lord and all the things that you hope when they're married, but you don't necessarily know for sure who you are marrying. You certainly don't know all the things that they will do and be. And just think, if you knew before the wedding day all the ways that your spouse was going to hurt you or disappoint you or fail you, whether you would still say, okay, yeah, I'll still get married. Some of you might second guess that. Maybe if you saw the ways you're going to hurt the other person, and sin against you, like maybe I don't want to do this and put someone else through that, right? Like, you just don't know when you get married, and yet we make this crazy, commitment to each other. God knows, eyes wide open, everything about you when he covenanted himself to you. We don't have to be ashamed. We don't have to be afraid. It's a positive thing. But in the case of Dan, the tribe of Dan, and this Levite, of course, these are wicked, selfish, ignoble people. And the motive, whatever it is, whether he's hedging his bets, whether he's trying to be clever, whether he's trying to give himself a little wiggle room if God calls him into account, like, well, technically God didn't say anything wrong, we know that the heart motive is evil. But for those who are Christians, we know that even our evil intentions God sees. Anyway, fundamentally, this Levite then was doing wrong at a heart level, even if what he said was technically not wrong. He was, however, using God's name in vain, breaking the third commandment, because he was effectively claiming God was saying something in that moment he did not say. We know for sure that God was not speaking through him prophetically. This is him just uttering it on his own. And it's a dangerous thing to say God said something he did not say. It's all over Scripture. Just give you one example. This happens a lot in the book of Jeremiah, but I'll just give you one example from there. Jeremiah 14:14. He says, Yahweh said to me, the prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I did not send them, nor did I command them or speak to them. They are prophesying to you a lying vision, worthless divination, and the deceit of their own minds. And so he promises sword and famine for those who would speak on the behalf of God when he said nothing. You see it also in Jeremiah 23, Matthew 7:15, 2 Timothy 3, Revelation 2:20. Just don't say God said something he did not say. It's a hallmark of a false prophet, a false priest in this case. Now, these Danites, they don't care. They're not righteous people. They're not looking out for false prophets or false teachers. They sought a false prophet, a false teacher, a false priest. And so with false confidence, because of this false priest who worships a false god, they head north all the way to Laish, about 125 miles away, where this next part happens, verse 7. Then the 5 men departed, came to Laish, and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, what do you report? They said, arise, and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in earth. So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Mahane Dan to this day, encampment of Dan. Behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Laish is about where the border is between Lebanon and Syria today. The Golan Heights is right there. If you've ever heard of the Golan Heights, it's sort of sad that there's so much violence that occurs there because it's a beautiful piece of land. You can look up pictures on Google if you want of Mount Hermon or of this area. The archaeological site is called Tel Dan. It's the Hill of Dan, where they find many archaeological discoveries, but there's beautiful pictures of this area. One commentator, Arthur Lewis, writes, travelers who have visited the Hula Valley and the vicinity of Dan expound on the natural resources and the fertility of the area. Water comes from every rock and hill, pouring down from the nearby mountains of Lebanon. Like Scotland, this part of Galilee is green and overgrown with all forms of vegetation. The tribe of Dan had seized upon a veritable paradise on earth. Not only that, the people who occupied this land were like Sidonians. The Sidonians, they lived by trade and commerce. They were not a warring people. They tried to negotiate. They tried to get along with people. They tried to be the people that everyone got along with so that they can make trade, right? But they were like Sidonians in that sense, and Sidonians were known for that, but they were isolated from the Sidonians because of the mountainous region there in Lebanon and Syria, and so they had no allies or treaties. It was just them there in Laish. Sadly, they were like ripe fruit, ready to be picked, with no one to protect them. So when the five returned home to report, they essentially report on not only is this land beautiful and would totally sustain us, but the people there, they have no clue. They have no clue. Totally unsuspecting. It says that twice, numerous times actually. And they invoke here this mandate that they go and take it as if this was their right. They speak of it in the way that they should have spoken of the land that was given to them, which was also fertile and lush, and it had access to the ocean and the beaches. But instead, they, outside of God's prerogative and command, they thought they found a greener pasture. And so they go, and on the way, they invoke providence, saying God has given it into our hands. Again, this is blasphemy. This is to use God's name in vain. And again, before you start jumping to judgment, oh, that's silly. This is like, you've probably done this too. This is like interpreting that, this power tool or this dress went on sale. It's a sign from God that I need to buy it. Right? If you've ever done that kind of shenanigan, where obviously God wants me to do it, he wouldn't have opened this door if he didn't want me to step through it. So yeah, this power tool I've been eyeballing, it went on sale? I mean, come on, how clear of a sign from God do you want that I should spend the money and get this? And it's almost like that. I mean, you can justify anything that way, right? Just because the opportunity is there means that God wills it? No. Sometimes God puts things in our ways so that we can choose not to do the thing, especially when it's sin. And that's clear. This is sin. Again, everything that's happening here is sin. They already know what God had directly and distinctly given them. They had an inheritance in the land, but instead they're invoking God's name to say, no, this other thing. You could just, you get married. And that was God's design for you. That's God's providence, that's God's will, is that you be married to that person. And you say, well, but I met someone at work who just gets me so much better than my wife gets me. If God didn't want me to be attracted, why do I feel this way? Why is she there? Obviously, God is meeting my needs, and so I should leave my wife and go with her. All the doors are open for it. It's not how God works. You don't just get to invoke the Lord's name for opportunities that come before you, especially when there are opportunities to sin. And you get the idea. They bring 600 men with them. That's a pretty small number. But again, the people of Laish, they're unsuspecting and they're not warlike. I just like the phrase shooting fish in a barrel. The idea that these people are like puppies, enjoying their fertile land, and these big burly hunters are coming just to wipe them out. You're supposed to feel that way. These are innocent people. And once again did they come to the house of Micah, verse 14. Then the 5 men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, do you know that in these houses there are an ephod, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image? Now, therefore, consider what you will do. And they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And when these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, the priest said to them, what are you doing? And they said to him, keep quiet, put your hand on your mouth, and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be priest to the house of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel? And the priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. The 5 men intimate to the 600 men that there's an opportunity at this house to ask for a blessing maybe, or maybe take a blessing. There's an opportunity to, we didn't really bring any idols to worship there in Laish, so, this house practically got, it's prepackaged for you. It's like Costco, everything's there. You just pick it all up and we'll go into Laish and we'll have everything we need to start idol worshiping. And so the Danites practiced their pillaging on Micah. You can imagine the priest is there, his 600 soldiers. He's trying to figure out what's going on. The 5 guys are behind his back, starting to take his stuff. What's going on here? Now, there's not a whole lot that the Levite can do, of course, but you don't get the impression that he's necessarily afraid. He is more than willing to go along with this plan. Now, Spurgeon, commenting on the scene, says, does it not read like a caricature? How insane a thing that men should steal what they had worshipped and afterwards worship what they stole. I mean, you're stealing something to worship something you stole. What does it say about the morality of that God? The allegiance of that God, the loyalties of that God, let alone your own loyalties. You steal the gods that you're going to worship. There's a senselessness to idolatry. Isaiah had some wise words about this in Isaiah 44. And it's an image that, a word picture that I think is so helpful to talk to anybody, really, even now, that worships like idols and little figures. And you might know people that have these things. He talks about the foolishness of idolatry. In verse 15, he's talking about planting a tree, right? And cutting it down. He says, then it becomes fuel for a man. You cut down this tree that you planted. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and breaks bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over the half he eats meat, he roasts it and is satisfied. Also, he warms himself and says, I am warm. I have seen the fire. And the rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, deliver me, for you are my God. They know not, nor do they discern, for he has shut their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so that they cannot understand. Just think about it. Same tree, same piece of wood. I use half of it however I want. I cut it, I mold it, I shape it, I use it, I burn it. It serves me. And then the other half, I carve into an image and say, this is God, and I serve it. Same piece of wood. This is the foolishness of idolatry. This is the senselessness of worshiping anything other than the one and only true God, King of the universe. Now this Levite, he should be the first to point out these kinds of inconsistencies and this kind of senselessness. You really don't like this Levite. You end up really not liking him, I hope. They are supposed to be, of all the tribes, Levites were supposed to be symbols of loyalty and faithfulness to the Lord. They were to be loyal to God and loyal to his people because it was their job to keep the people close to God. So they had to be loyal to the people or to God, and they had to be loyal to the people because they are the ones that are trying to draw them together when the people start to stray. Their whole identity is loyalty. But this guy has no loyalty to anyone except himself. Not to Yahweh, not to Micah, not even to the tribe of Dan. He takes their offer to be their private priest, and it makes him happy that he's gotten a promotion as a priest for hire. Spurgeon again says, the man who had already sold himself was easily bought. I saw a random question the other day. Would you cut your spouse's hair in his or her sleep for $100,000? And you see other challenges like that amounting to how much would you debase yourself for money, right? Would you stay in a room isolated from everyone for a year for $10 million, right? I don't know if you've ever seen those kinds of challenges. And they ultimately amount to that there's a dollar figure that you can attach to degrading yourself or degrading other people. Right? That there's a price that everyone can hit that you are going to be willing to do this thing. $100,000? No. Cut my wife's hair in the middle of the night? No way. $1 billion? Would she be pretty understanding of $1 billion? Like, that's an enormous amount of money. Just for some hair that's going to grow back. Right? I mean, she surely would understand that. Huh?
Just buy her a wig.
Yeah, buy her a wig. $1 billion can buy so many wigs, right? But here's the problem with all of these things, and here's a problem with this priest. It's not about whether my life is worth anything. My life is not worth very much, truth be told. It isn't. My life is God's. That's the point. The reason I cannot sell myself for $1 billion or $1 trillion is because I have no right to sell myself. It's not about how much I am worth per se, that I'm of infinite worth. That's not necessarily the point. The point is that I am God's. I've been bought with a price. He owns me, and I cannot do something with me that God would not want me to do. So if it isn't like that I have a price figure on my life. Now, to be honest, like, in lawsuits and all sorts of things, they end up having to put a number on someone's life. Millions of dollars in a wrongful death, suit or something like that. And understand there's some sense of justice. You see that even in, Exodus and Deuteronomy and laws regarding manslaughter and things like that. There's a compensation that needs to be made. But as far as like debasing or degrading myself, putting myself for sale, it's not that I think I'm worth infinitely much and you could never afford me. It's just that I'm not my own. I cannot do whatever I want with me. So I'm not up for sale because I'm owned by God. That's more or the better principle. This Levite was owned by God. He was never up for sale to begin with. There was no number that could have been offered that would make it right, just like there's no number that would make it right to unsuspecting shave my wife's hair. I don't think there is a right number for that because as a husband, it's not a right stewardship of the gift of my wife. And you can debate me on that if you want. Maybe I have an arrangement beforehand, like, listen, Catherine, if ever someone just gave me a crazy offer for a certain amount of money, is there an amount that you're like okay with? Right? Just let's settle that right now. Let's get in writing. You can't be mad. So maybe if you made some kind of deal ahead of time, if that ever kind of came up, get some kind of blank check offer. But even then, maybe not. You're not your own. Anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. So this priest, he's got a price tag, though. He doesn't realize he is the Lord's, for the Lord to do with. Now, verse 21, so they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What is the matter with you, that you come with such a company?" And Micah said, "You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away? And what have I left? How then do you ask me, what is the matter with you?" And the people of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." And the people of Dan went their way. And when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. So, the kids and cattle are there because the 600 men brought their families. They're so sure of their victory in Laish that they brought a whole party, their whole families and caravan to go to Laish. They were very confident that they were not going to need to go back. So they even brought their kids to this, and they're at the front because the 600 men in the back, because the people of Dan or the people of Micah's household might come out and try to start something, which they did. But of course, there's too many. Micah is barking up the wrong tree here. It almost seems like there's going to be a conflict. But Dan, again, his name means judge, is nothing if not a bully and unjust, which are the opposite qualities a judge should possess. They're bullies, unjust. And it's ironic that Micah's gods could be stolen and needed his protection. Again, Spurgeon did a lot of Spurgeon for this. Spurgeon points out that he was foolish to trust in gods which could not take care of themselves. Micah loved these gods because they were his precious possessions that he made. It's pretty eye-opening if you think about it, how truly absurd it is to have gods that someone can just take away from you. God is supposed to be the one that protects us because we are precious to him, and he keeps us in his hand, not the opposite, where God needs to be protected by us because it's precious to me because I made it. It's totally backward. And it's not unexpected that Micah backs off. And hopefully you can hope that he learned a lesson as God finally brought judgment for his idolatry. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made, verse 27, and the priests who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, a people quiet and unsuspecting, says it again, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at first. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. It's, of course, not surprising that they make quick work of these very quiet, peaceful, unsuspecting citizens of Laish. They renamed the city Dan, which is what is on the maps that you'll see. And again, the phrase Dan to Beersheba ends up referring to the whole entirety of Israel from here on out, Dan being the northernmost part, very far from where they started, 100 to 125 miles. And Jonathan is revealed finally to be the name of the Levite. Saved it for the end there, because it's supposed to be like a little twist, like a movie that has a twist ending. People are supposed to get to the end and be like, that's how the priests in Dan got their start? That's how they ended up, the tribe of Dan ended up so far north? And the priesthood in Dan is actually started by a descendant of Moses himself. It's like a twist. If you made a movie, this would be a total twist in their minds, all of it, because it's all wrong. It's all bad. This continues on, this worship, until the captivity of the land. This is probably referring to the Assyrian captivity, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, 700 years later. No, hold on, 300 years later or so. That this priesthood, this separate priesthood existed. Shiloh was the place where the tabernacle was and the Ark of the Covenant, and they were supposed to worship God in Shiloh with the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. So this false worship existed in Dan for as long as real worship existed. When the kingdom splits, so hundreds of years later, you have, after the time of Judges, you have Saul, King Saul, who's not a true king. Then you have King David, who's like the first true king of Israel. And you have Solomon, his son. And then after Solomon, the kingdom splits, 10 tribes in the north and 2 tribes in the south. Now, originally Dan was kind of in the middle, but now they're actually representative of the very far north of the northern kingdoms. And King Jeroboam, the evil king of those northern tribes, he sets up 2 idol worship centers in the northern kingdom. Where does he make them? One's in Bethel, and the other is in Dan. So he sets up, because of the incidents here, Dan ends up being a place of idol worship for centuries. Because of what happens here in Micah, his idolatry is multiplied, not only to Dan, but to the whole northern kingdom. This is how idolatry multiplies. This is what it means. Everyone did right what was in their own eye, what was right in their own eyes. This is what it means that there's no king in Israel, as this idolatry would spread. Dan is omitted in Revelation 7. Revelation 7, you talk about there's going to be 144,000 Jews that are sealed, 12,000 from each tribe. But Dan is omitted. Another tribe is put in there. Get into logistics. There's 2 half tribes, Manasseh, Ephraim. You don't need to worry about that. But it seems like they're replaced. And it's perhaps because of this history and this legacy that Dan has of idol worship. Dan has declining significance as you go further in the story of Israel. It's a sad tale. It starts with Micah, but it quickly spreads. Again, idolatry is not as obvious as just setting up a little altar in your house and worshiping a little figure. Yes, you probably have maybe some family members, I do, I'm Asian, that have that kind of thing in it. But it could be as simple as some of the examples we're using, where you're trying to wheel and deal with God, where you're just interpreting, God, obviously you want me to cheat on my taxes. You wouldn't have made it so obvious and so easy to do if you didn't want me to. That is all idolatry too. The idea of selling yourself. It doesn't necessarily mean for money or price, but your integrity. That's idolatry too. All of these things are things that can spread in a household or in a church or in a nation. It should be very clear to us that we ought not to be like the people of Dan, to understand what God has given us and be faithful with it. Stewardship. If only Dan had been faithful stewards of what God had given them, none of this would have happened. What has God given you to be a faithful steward of? Are you satisfied with it? Or are you making idols? Are you coveting what God has given to others? It's a sure path to idolatry. If you're not a Christian this afternoon, this life is just an endless pursuit and chase of different idols, different highs, different goals, thinking that they will satisfy or give ultimate meaning and purpose. And some of them might give you a little bit of a stirring. Some of them might seem very fulfilling for a short while. But faced with eternity, faced with the infinite, faced with your sin, how do you make up for it? How can you right any wrong you've ever done? How can you stand before a God who sees every single desire and intent of your heart? You can't on your own merit or works. God provided for us, and all of these things when we see Judges, we're always looking ahead to a perfect judge who not only sees it rightly and will judge it perfectly, but also says, I've seen it, and I don't want this person to perish. I'll also pay the price for that sin. Jesus Christ, not just the judge, but our Savior. These poor men and women and children of Laish had no deliverer. We have a deliverer, Jesus Christ. We might seem to be helpless in this life, and we know we might be taken advantage of. The memory verse that we're doing in the morning is that regarded as sheep to be slaughtered all the day long. But no, we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. And so, If you have any questions about what it means to know Jesus or that he sees everything and still loves us, would love to talk to you about that.